I highly encourage you to make sure in the scoring rubric for yesterday's question that you look at pages 12 through 14 in detail and just refresh yourself with what is very specific to do for the confidence intervals and look at the various alternative answers they would have accepted for these components. I don't think there's any big surprises in this question, but please let me know if you have questions on it. That then leads us into day 16 review, where we're just going to highlight how we do testing of claim in Chapter 9. Remember, if you understood confidence intervals, the tests themselves weren't that bad. It's the same thing. We're going to look at how to do a test in general in Section 1. Section 2 was for proportions or our categorical data, and Section 3 was the means or our quantitative data. In addition to that, we talked about Type 1 and Type 2 errors. So make sure to refresh your memory on how those work. About hypothesis tests themselves, remember you're going to have to define if it's a one-sided or a two-sided just based on the scenario. And I think people did a nice job of that. The one thing I would highly encourage you to do is really understand what the definition of p-value is. I have seen the AP board ask you either to write the definition of p-value or be able to recognize it within a multiple choice question. What p-value is, again, is this. I like to write it as the probability of our statistic given H SPO is true. So if you look at it that way, given the fact that the null hypothesis is true, what is the probability that our statistic that we took or something more extreme actually happened? That is what a p-value is by definition, so make sure you're comfortable with that. Is different from probability. What's the general probability means in the long term is what you would expect to happen if you repeated an experiment over and over again. So don't confuse those two together. P-value also does not mean what your conclusion is for a hypothesis test. That's completely different. That is just stating the conclusion in itself. When we do state our conclusions, remember we're always going to have the three components. We're going to compare our p to alpha. We're going to say if we reject or fail to reject H sub O, and we either conclude or fail to conclude H sub A. You never ever conclude H sub O. We also then talked about Type 1 and Type 2 errors. A Type 1 error is if we reject H sub O when in fact it was true. Type 2, we fail to reject H sub O when it actually was false. So I like to say for Type 2 is when we fail to reject, and you actually have that kind of connection with the number 2 and 2 to help you remember. Power. The power of a test, I do recommend if you're struggling with this still to look back at your Chapter 9 note packet. The power is what is the ability of the current test that we chose to do. What's its ability to actually detect that there's truly a different null hypothesis that we should have done? How strong is it? And how can you manipulate the power? Do remember that the Type 2 error is 1 minus the power. The Type 1 error is actually the alpha value that you chose. So if we chose a 5% alpha, that's our Type 1 error. That then brought us into Section 9.2, and 9.2 is specifically doing a hypothesis test for the proportions or our categorical data. In this one, we're going to look at our Z statistic, and it's going to be this value right here using our p hats. And then we would have the thing that we did in our confidence interval, our state, plan, do, and conclude. Check your conditions. In this case, be careful the condition that we're using for normalcy. We used to do n times p hat was greater than or equal to 10 for the confidence interval. For the hypothesis test, it's n times p naught. So whatever your p naught was in your hypothesis is what you're going to use for that. This right here I think is a really good point to make note of, is that the confidence interval provides additional information. Significant tests do not. If you're asked if you want to know what is the amount of the difference versus is the difference there or not, you might do a confidence interval. If you choose to do a test, if you do a two-sided test, the two-sided test can be used to say, yes, we fail to reject H sub O or we don't fail to reject H sub O. But you also could do, instead of a two-sided test, you could construct a confidence interval, and it'll actually give you the range of what is acceptable and not acceptable for rejection too. If the value of your null hypothesis is within the confidence interval that you construct, then you would say that you fail to reject H sub O and cannot conclude H sub A. But if the value of your null hypothesis is outside of your confidence interval, you could reject H sub O and you could conclude H sub A is the connection you would make for that. Again, I recommend for Chapter 9, feel free to go back into your Chapter 9 packet that you have or read in detail these summary highlights if it's helpful. In 9.3, we wrapped up with looking at the means or quantitative data. Again, we're switching over to the T statistics, so we are going to talk about degrees of freedom and test our conditions like we used to do before. It may happen that we're going to look at paired data this time. So if it's one sample, that's great, but if it's two different samples that can be paired together and brought down into one sample, that would be the differences on that and not two samples. So you just have to be smart if it's two samples or if it's combined to become one sample in paired data. Please do finish reading through the highlights here and then move on to your multiple choice and then your free response for today. There are actually two different free responses you can try, and I would recommend that you do look at both of them. The first one is 2009, the second alternative test. It was problem number 4. Try it and click on your solutions and see how well you did on this one when you're done. This does have some nice review of coming into Chapter 4, using some blocking, but really talks about the power. The other question that's good to do is number 6. It's from 2006, again, the alternative test. Now, number 6 is one of the samples of an investigative question where they would say of your 90 minutes to do the 6 free responses, again, 10 to maybe 15 minutes on the first 5, but about 20 to 25 on the last one. They suggest giving yourself enough lead time to try this problem. So why don't you go ahead and when you try this one, I think you're going to find that the first page here is data and information that you have been taught. But when you get to the last portion of it, when you look at letter E and letter F, this is kind of some new stuff. They want to see how well you would analyze and what would you do to make your conclusions for these questions. So good luck on your Day 16 review.